Right, so in my last video, we were taking a look at some of the evidence that has been released regarding the 8-passenger situation with Ruby, Frank, and Joey Hildebrand, where they have been arrested. Obviously, the arrest happened quite a long time ago at this point. We've been covering it ever since it did happen, but the evidence had just been released, and there's a lot of it. So in my last video, I didn't get a chance to cover all of it. So since that last video, I've now came across more evidence that is a lot more damning and gives us a much better idea of what's actually happened here. Like, what bit have we been missing throughout this? And more specifically, we're going to be looking at a more up-to-date interview with Kevin Frankie. Obviously, we looked at his first one with the police in the last video, where he didn't say too much. He said quite a bit, but he was still a bit vague throughout it. Whereas in this newer interview, he basically gives a timeline of the separation with Ruby and when he thought that things started to get worse with Jodie. And then on top of that, we're also going to be looking at Ruby Frankie's journal that has been released. It's a 60-page journal. A lot has been redacted, but a lot hasn't at the same time, and it is horrifying to say the least. But first things first, let's take a look at a more recent Kevin Frankie interview compared to the last one we looked at, and I actually saw it on the Hidden True Crime YouTube channel. It's called Kevin Frankie Police Interview, Kevin dubbed Resident Exorcist. And it's a 50-minute interview, so I'm obviously not going to cover every single part. I'm just going to cover the key points in my opinion. If you want to see the full thing, then obviously you can go to the Hidden True Crime YouTube channel. They've got it uploaded there. So like I said, Kevin basically gives a timeline as to how this all happened, specifically with Ruby's relationship with Jodie. And he says that the reason that this started is because Ruby had a friend that was a massive fan of Jodie and connections, so she started meeting with Jodie.
Ruby had a very close friend named Paige Hannah, who lives in Mapleton, who was a massive fan of Connections and Joey Hildebrand. And in fact, the Hannahs are on the cover of their book, if you've probably seen them. And so Ruby started to speak with Jodie towards the end of 2018, early 2019.
So one thing we'll see throughout this is that the Hannahs were mentioned a lot. This is a name that I don't think we've ever spoke about throughout this whole situation. I'm not even sure if I'd even heard of them before this. And I believe the Hannahs are some wealthy investors who were obviously big fans of Jodie Hildebrand and were members of Connections. That's to the best of my knowledge. I could be slightly wrong. But then Kevin goes on to say that the Hannahs were trying to get Ruby to be part of Connections, and they ended up going to a conference, and in Kevin's own words, he said he believed that it was full of men hating women.
This is absolute craziness. This is a bunch of man hating women that are just looking for excuses to tear down their husbands, and I mean that's what it felt like to me when I was in there.
But even though Kevin says that he was hesitant, he says that they ended up convincing him to be a part of it for 3 months, I believe. And just as he was about to leave, they challenged him to talk to Ruby to see what stuff he's done wrong in the relationship. And then this is where Ruby mentions that she has a problem with the way that Kevin, asks for sex.
Shared how she felt in our marriage and how the things that I, over 20 years of marriage, asking for sex as a husband frequently, or asking her to wear lingerie or things like that, how that made her feel.
And when I heard this part of the interview, it reminded me of a video we covered ages ago, over a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago at this point. But it was a video that was on Connections where Kevin and Ruby are talking about the fact that Kevin thought there was a song and dance about sex in his own words.
Well, I'll just say it. I wanted to have sex a lot. And so I knew it. There was a song and dance. Every time I wanted it, it was like, I've got to do something.
So yeah, like I said, this is a video that I posted February 10th, 2022. So when I was obviously making these videos, this seems like this was the situation going on behind the cameras. He then carries on to say that he felt like his marriage was getting better and better through Jodie after being seeing her and getting advice from her. But then Jodie actually took the inner circle members of Connections and told them that she feels like she's being tormented by shadow figures.
All the people who were being trained as mental fitness coaches and stuff. So that was Ruby and a bunch of other people and their spouses. We went out to a dinner afterwards, and that's where Jodie really opened up to the women in a private conversation that she believed she was being tormented and haunted by shadow figures every night.
And it seems like throughout this, at least from just bearing in mind what Kevin said in his interview, obviously, I don't know if he's telling the truth about this stuff. I don't trust anyone really involved with this. But it seems like Jodie used this information to her advantage. She was obviously telling people that she was haunted and being tormented by shadow figures. People wanted to, like, protect her and whatnot. And it seemingly became a whole thing where a lot of people, including Ruby, wanted to protect Jodie from these shadow figures and whatnot, and they felt like Jodie could have these visions and see stuff that no other people could see. And it looks like this is how she's manipulated these people to make them think that what she's saying is always true and whatnot, and she can get them to do whatever she wants. I mean, it does sound like something Jodie would do. But it was at this point that the Hannahs apparently let Jodie stay at their house for 2 weeks, and Kevin says that there's 2 potential stories that happened here depending on who you ask. According to Jodie, she was trapped against her will, and she had managed to escape after the 6 weeks. And according to the Hannahs, Jodie would constantly stab herself with forks, and she tried seducing the husband of the family, so they end up kicking her out. Now, it was around this time that Jodie actually reached back out to Ruby to try and get help, and Kevin says that Ruby was always jealous about the Hannah's relationship with Jodie. She wanted to be close to Jodie.
But the point is, somewhere around mid-April, Jodie was back in her home in Ivans, and she was a hot mess. And she reached out to Ruby for help. And Ruby was always jealous of the Hannahs, that they had a better relationship with Jodie than she did.
And I mean, it's clear as day that Ruby would genuinely do anything that Jodie says throughout this. We hear some more information later on about the fact that Ruby was willing to give Jodie the 8 Passengers channel and sign off a bunch of stuff that she owns to Jodie. Like, for some reason, she trusted Jodie with everything. And obviously, knowing all the information that we know, even before this situation happened, just judging off the videos, it's mind-boggling to all of us why she would trust a woman like that. But she did. It was at this point that Ruby and Kevin went around Jodie's house, and Kevin says that he could hear like bangs in the basement, and like plates were just magically flying off shelves and smashing on the floor and whatnot. And Ruby really wanted to help Jodie, so Ruby suggested that Jodie should go and live with them instead, to which Kevin was against at first, but then he ended up doing it. Apparently when Jodie lived with Kevin and Ruby, she would have these visions constantly where she would need to be checked up on non-stop, and it got to the point where Ruby decided, right, I'm going to stop going up to check on her so often, I'm just going to sleep in the same bed as her.
Started like every 4 hours at night, and then it moved every 2 hours at night, and it moved every hour at night, and then at some point Ruby said, you know what, I'm just going to start sleeping in there, and if I need you, I'll come down and get you. I'm like, that's kind of weird, but okay. And that was that. They started sleeping in the same bed.
And it was at this point we had the first mention of Pam Bodger, who of course we mentioned after the arrest because she's listed on the Connections website. We didn't know exactly what her involvement was with this situation in particular. We didn't know exactly how close they were. I did in my video show that clearly they are pretty close because they're going on holiday together non-stop. Well, Kevin says that Pam was pretty involved with all of this. In fact, the 3 of them would stay in a room for hours and have like these visions together.
Ruby, Pam, and Jodie would get together and do these interventions. That's what they call them. And so they'd just go up and lock themselves in a room for 4 or 5 hours, and then they'd come out and they'd all just be on cloud 9, and Ruby would share with me like she had this amazing vision, and I wrote it and recorded it all down, and we have a work to do from God, and you're part of it, and the bishop's part of it, and we're all part of bringing all this stuff to the world.
And I mean, if anyone's ever watched that Netflix show with that Laurie Vallow, I think it was called, like A Mother of Our Sins, I believe it was called. And this story, and bear in mind, people have been making this comparison since even before the arrest, like when we were watching the Connections videos. But the more and more you hear about this story, it doesn't half sound like it. But when you do make that comparison, you do think to yourself, like, how far would this have went if they weren't caught? Like, how long was this going to go on for? How bad was it going to get? It could have ended drastically, and like, I don't want to make assumptions because it's incredibly sad. But like, I mean, if you looked at the condition of what the children were in, especially with the way that they hadn't been fed, they were like ridiculously malnourished. It could have ended badly, and which is heartbreaking. I'm really fucking glad it didn't. But yeah, I mean, if this went on longer, who knows? So then throughout the rest of this interview, Kevin mentions a few different times when Ruby said that they should separate. It started off by saying like, let's just separate, but we'll live in the same house. We just can't speak to each other as much. It then ended up being like, let's have a full separation. But Kevin also says that he needed permission to do anything in his own house. If he left, he would have to get permission to come back. He wouldn't be allowed on the same floor as Jodie, and just a bunch of other different things.
It was hard. Basically, there were all these rules now placed on me. Like, I could leave when I wanted, but I couldn't come back until Ruby gave me permission. I couldn't come into the kitchen to eat until Ruby gave me permission. And the upstairs where Jodie roamed was completely off limits. I couldn't go upstairs anymore in my own house.
And I mean, look, from the stories we've heard of Jodie, this doesn't sound far-fetched in the single slightest. We've heard similar stories in the past. So as much as I do think that Kevin is a lot more responsible for everything that's went on than what is being portrayed, I believe this story because it's Jodie Hildebrandt we're talking about here. She does this type of stuff. He then goes on to say that Ruby was trying to give 8 passengers to Jodie, and on top of that, she just wanted to give a lot of stuff that she owned, basically everything she owned, over to Jodie, and she would get nothing in return.
So basically the contract was Ruby gives Jodie everything, and Ruby gets nothing in return.
I mean, this type of stuff does make sense as to why Jodie lives in such a big house. I've always wondered that, right? Like, how has she got so much money? Because her house was huge. And Kevin even said at the beginning of this interview, when he first went over to the house, he thought to himself, like, how does a therapist live like this? But this is clearly the type of stuff that makes her so rich. She manipulates people somehow to basically give over everything they own. I mean, later in this interview, Kevin says that Chad, his son, who was 17 at the time, was paying Jodie $900 a month for therapy. And it goes without saying, $900 to a 17-year-old is a lot of money. Kevin says that it was the vast majority of his wage every single month, and Jodie was just taking that from him. But yeah, Kevin then goes on to say that Ruby, Pam, and Jodie went away on vacation, and they went to Arizona, which is one of the images that I showed in a previous video when we were trying to find out who Pam Bodger was. And when they came back from Arizona, that is when Ruby wanted to go through the full separation with Kevin. And he also goes on to say that Jodie Hildebrandt was the one dictating everything that happens throughout this separation. He says that anything that Jodie says, people follow. If she wants to pile it in on someone, people will pile it in on that person. If she wants to praise someone, people will praise that person.
I felt like I got knocked to the bottom, and Jodie was just piling on me every week in the men's groups. And the other men just do whatever Jodie does. If Jodie piles on somebody, they all pile on. If Jodie praises somebody, they all praise. And so it really felt like a pack of dogs.
Kevin also says that Jodie originally approved a few people that Kevin was allowed to speak to. These were the only people that he was allowed to speak to. But then that quickly changed when Jodie said that she had spoke to God, and apparently God told her that Kevin can't speak to anyone other than God.
And that's where I was all the way up until the last week of July, when Jodie called me one day out of the blue and just said, I don't understand why you're not getting it. You're not changing. I don't get it. So I've been asking God what to do, and God told me that you need just to have complete, what's the word they would use? Solitude with God.
And then the interview ends with Kevin explaining what these visions actually were that Ruby and Jodie were apparently having constantly.
So, like, one of them, she was walking along the beach with Jesus, and Jesus challenged her to go walk on the water, and it was a whole lesson on walking on the water. Another, she would walk with Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, and she learned about, she had a pet lion in heaven named Charles. I don't know why I never forgot that name, but it was like this massive lion, and she got to ride the lion and learned that, all about who she was and this pet lion and all.
So yeah, that is the summary of this 50-minute interview. Like I said, I haven't covered everything because we would be here for over 50 minutes. So if you do want to see the full thing, then I'll leave a link in the description. I think it does put a lot more stuff in perspective, at least gives a timeline of how this all happened. Because to us, it really did seem that Ruby and Geordie just like appeared together out of nowhere, and they went even more extreme than Ruby originally was, which was already extreme. And yeah, a lot of the stuff that we heard in this interview is very similar to stuff that we'd heard about in situations that happened over a decade ago. Like, Geordie was still doing the exact same stuff. She was still trying to ruin marriages. She was scamming people out of money left, right, and center. Like, this is the type of stuff she does. But either way, let's move on to Ruby's journal that has been released. Like I said, it was 60 pages. A lot has been redacted throughout it, but a lot hasn't at the same time. And it's basically a journal where Ruby would document everything that she has done to her kids. I have no idea why she decided to document all of this. I'm glad she did because it provides evidence in the case, right? But yeah, I mean, some of this stuff is genuinely horrifying. So we're gonna go through a few of them now, like this one here that says, R refuses to do wall sits. He says he is done. This is obviously a punishment that Ruby would give her son, making him do wall sits. R is to stay outside, sleep outside, only come in to use the bathroom and shower, which, I mean, it's so grim. Forcing a little child to stay outside and sleep outside, I mean, how evil can you be? E refuses to work, screams, has hair shaved off. Yeah, this is what Ruby was doing with her daughter. She'd shave her hair off as a punishment. And in fact, I've actually heard from like clips and whatnot and from the police reports that when they originally actually got to Geordie's home and they found E in the closet, and it took 4 hours for her to leave because she was terrified. But they actually thought E was a boy at first because she had her hair shaved off and she was like complete like malnourished. Incredibly sad. It says, it's R's birthday. He doesn't even know what month it is. Like, she's almost like bragging about it here. Like, it's his birthday, but he doesn't know it because he doesn't even know what month it is. And to put this in perspective, when the police spoke to R, they asked, how long's it been since you've seen your sister? Bear in mind, they live in the same home. And he said it had been a month. He hadn't seen his sister in a month, even though they lived in the same home. They were just completely separated. I told R he emulates a snake. He slithers and sneaks around looking for opportunities when no one is watching. Yeah, I mean, just reading this really does put in perspective just how evil Ruby is. And look, things did seem to get worse with Geordie, right? But this is what Ruby is doing to her own children. Like, she cannot use the excuse like she's been trying to do that she's been manipulated by Geordie. It's her own children. She should know how horrible this is, but apparently she didn't. I mean, this one again is incredibly sad. It says, R told me he would rather have a glass of water than me as his mother. Obviously, because they were completely deprived of food and water, this was kind of part of their punishment for some reason. And Ruby's even writing here how R was saying that he'd rather have a glass of water than Ruby as his mother. I mean, just to put in perspective the water situation here, Ruby says he drinks water from the hose, steals water. So because Ruby wouldn't give him any water, he decided to have water from out of the hose, which in itself is disgusting. The fact that he would even feel like he has to do that is vile. But to add on top of that, Ruby claims that this is stealing water. I don't even know how to explain and put in perspective like how evil that is. I asked her if she felt like she had made progress over the 8 weeks. Yes, she said. I told her she was delusional. She has made no progress. She continues to lie and manipulate. Last night, her screaming, trans head banging were evidence of no change. Sorry, I'm struggling to read the handwriting a bit. But yeah, there's just loads and loads of pages similar to this of Ruby just documenting everything, which again, I'm glad she did document it because it's evidence. But the fact that this was even happening is horrible. And in fact, I've actually heard from this Hulu documentary that I've only managed to see clips from because it's not available in the UK. But I saw that a lot of the police and the medical staff were saying that this is one of, if not the worst cases they have seen. Again, we're talking about how E's hair's been shaved, and Ruby even says stuff like, if she is going to act sick, she can look sick. I mean, what the fuck? And yeah, just carries on explaining stuff like, I put her in the dog wash and shaved her head. I mean, Jesus Christ, like, this is so sad that this was going on for so long. When E was outside today and it was hot, she acted like she was dying. So pitiful. I mean, like, yeah, you haven't been feeding them or letting them drink water and punishing them physically non-stop. Like, this is what was happening. And for some reason, Ruby didn't think that they were going through, like, physical pain. I don't know. What was her perspective here? Because she even said in the call to Kevin when she found out the kids had been taken to hospital, she said that this was sort of necessary. It was a big over-exaggeration. They didn't even need to go to hospital. I mean, look at this next sentence. I told her the heat in hell is much hotter. And yeah, it's so bad. And here's another form of punishment that Ruby would use, saying, I come back with a cactus poker. When I poke his back to get in the sun, he doesn't even flinch. I poke him on the neck. He is in a trance and doesn't appear to feel anything. So she would literally poke them with a cactus to get them to do stuff. I mean, yeah, like, look, this is clearly way worse than we could have ever imagined. Generally, the more and more evidence I see, the worse this gets somehow, just when you think that it couldn't get worse. I mean, just thankfully, the physical side of this is over now, right? Luckily, being the so fucking brave, managed to actually escape the house, find someone, and the physical side of this is over. The mental side of it probably is never going to be, which, again, is incredibly sad, but I'm just so glad that they don't have to be put through this constantly every single day anymore. I know I've said it before, but it's something that I think about a lot, especially when I make these videos, because I think back at like my first few videos on 8 Passengers from years ago, and we were talking about how bad it was then. Now when you look back at them videos, it doesn't even seem bad compared to the stuff we now know. But even then, when my opinions of Ruby were horrendous, right? Rock bottom, so bad, I still never thought that it would ever get to this point. And in fact, I looked at like an old video I did, not even one of the oldest ones, one just from maybe like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I was just trying to put myself back in that point of like making that video. And I would have never, ever assumed that it could get this bad. And I knew she was evil, but not this evil. But yeah, either way, that is more of the evidence that I didn't cover in the last video. Let me know your opinions down below on everything that we spoke about with the journal and Kevin's interview. And until the next one, I'll see you guys in a bit. Alright, goodbye.